Hello again, this is SickleYield. I'm here with the third video in my Introduction to DAZ Studio series. This one is called Your Second Render. The first tutorial was about setting up the interface. The second tutorial was about navigating the basics of lighting and the viewport. This one will be about using assets from your library, free or purchased. So I'm going to start with Genesis 3 Female. I have set my draw style to wire texture shaded so that we don't show nudity on YouTube inadvertently. I will change it back when we've got clothes on her. And I'm waiting for that to load. I have a lot of morphs, and the more morphs that you have, the longer it takes for the character to load. My Genesis 1 can take upwards of 2 minutes for sheer number of morphs that it has. Okay, so I'm going to go to clothing now. And the basic wear. The basic wear is free. It comes with the figure when you download the starter essentials. There we go. And then I will change my draw style back to texture shaded. I'm assuming you know these basic viewport navigation things because we talked about them in the first two tutorials. So I'm using the universal widget right now, the universal tool, which you can also activate by choosing Alt-Shift-U. Here I have Genesis 3 Female, and I've just loaded an outfit from the library. I found that outfit in my content library by going to People, Genesis 3 Female, Clothing, and Basic Wear in the nested folders. I'm using a tree file structure. I actually prefer side-by-side, so I'm going to change that. Now I have it side-by-side. And you can see I have a huge list of outfits here on the left. I buy a lot of content. I need to as a vendor in order to stay current and make sure that I don't reuse things in my promotional renders too often. But even without buying anything, you can get a fair amount of free content from sites such as sharecg.com. I will do a tutorial at some future point about adapting previous generations' clothing, but I cover that with some of my template products as well. So this is where a lot of those clothes are, and many of these clothes come with a full outfit preset, which should be on the far left or at the top of your list, because DAZ requires a vendor to submit that now. What that means is that if you select Genesis 3 Female, and you click on something like Dark Storm here, at the very top it says Dark Storm Outfit, and if I click on that, it'll load the entire outfit onto the character. It looks silly because it'll be on top of the basic wear, but I can delete that momentarily here. There we go. You'll notice that her feet have been posed to fit inside the boots, because that's actually part of the bootloader that it came with. So I'm going to go to Scene, double-click on Genesis 3 Female. Now you can see a list of everything that she's wearing. So I'm going to delete top and shorts. There we go. Now she's just wearing the Dark Storm outfit. Now, Genesis 3 Female at the moment has the default jean skin that she came with. I am going to use a Victoria 7 skin because it's a little bit nicer. And it's something that a lot of you probably have because Victoria 7 is usually an early purchase. So I'm going to go to Genesis 3 Female, Materials, Victoria 7, and Iray. And you can see that there's a legacy material here, which I believe is intended for versions of Studio before 4.9, probably version 4.8. So I'm going to use the all matte instead of that. And if you scroll down, you can see some different icons for eye color and so forth. I'm going to give her green eyes. And there's some different makeup options as well. I'll use Face 06 matte here. I'm not going to use the genitalia mattes because I'm not using the genitalia at the moment. And I will turn the normal maps on. Quick plug for my own product. I feel that you can get better render results with Victoria 7 and Beautiful Skin Iray. But you can get extremely good ones with just the shaders that she comes with if you use good lighting, which we're also going to talk about today. But first, we're going to give her a nice hair. So, Genesis 3 Female and hair. Click on that. I've got a large list of hairs here. I think that the Layton hair was available free or very inexpensively at some point early on in the figure's development, so I'm going to use that. It's a very nice hair by April YSH. There we go. And I'll select that and go to Materials, Iray. And I'm going to use one of the more colorful ones. I'm going to use this black and white material. There we go. Now, I have a default camera in the scene already. I'm going to click on that default camera, go to parameters and headlamp, and make sure the headlamp is off before I start actually looking at the lighting. And then I'm going to create a second camera so that I have a pullback that's not the perspective view. So I'm going to go to create new camera and call that pullback. You can always give a different name to your camera. And then that appears in the camera drop-down up on the top right of the 3D window. So I'll go to pullback there. And I can rotate around and see the outfit. You'll notice that she's not standing on the ground right now because her shoes are tall and her feet are posed. So we will need to adjust that before we actually render, but for now we're going to pose her and add an environment. Usually I create the character first and then build the environment around them. If you are, for example, a vendor who is selling a prop product or an environment yourself, you may wish to build the environment first and then add a character in it. But for the meantime, let's go to environments. In environments, I'm going to go to architecture. Again, I have a long list of things here, but I'm going to go down to DS_Ascension. That's Divinity Sky's Ascension. It is a product by Jack Tomlin in the Platinum Club. And if you're in the Platinum Club, it's $1.99. It's been out for a while, very inexpensive, very attractive product, so I'm going to use that. I'm going to go to Scenes, under that, and choose the preload, which will load the entire building here. And the building is quite large, and if I go to perspective view and hit the frame button, you can see that she's completely inside it. So I'm going to go back to my default camera view, and then my pullback view actually. And I'm going to left click to select that entire set of things under the building there, B_build. And I'm going to go to the parameters tab and I'm going to translate it downward on the y-axis. Now, it might seem more straightforward to you to move the character and leave the building at ground zero, but there are some things that I find to be easier if the character is still at the origin. So I actually usually move the building instead and just build the building around the character at the origin. So there we are. And I'm going to keep dragging that downward until her feet are standing on it, roughly. Okay. And now in the perspective, you can see how small she is compared to that entire building. And back to the pullback view. Now you'll notice that this is actually a square render setup I've got right here. I'm going to change that so that I can compose my scene better. So I'm going to go to the Render Settings tab and General, and I'm going to use the golden ratio in Portrait. If I were doing this as a render for my store, it would have to be 1000 by 13, but we're just doing this as an art render right now, so it can be whatever we like. So I'm going to use the golden ratio in the portrait, and there it is. And pull that back a little further. Maybe tilt down a little bit. I'm thinking of having the character sort of looking up longingly, so I want to be pulled back a little more distantly from her. Okay, there we go. And I'm going to put her over on the right side of this image, roughly in the middle. Then I'll be ready to add a pose. So I'm going to go to People, Genesis 3 Female, and Poses. There are several poses that came with the figure and some that came with Victoria 7. To make sure that we use one that everyone has, I'm going to stick with one of the basic ones here. So I will go with Fashion Model Pose 14, I guess. Start with that. And if I go to the default camera, there actually I'm going to use the perspective view and frame it in on the character so that I can see where her shoes ended up. And they actually look pretty good. Her toes are sticking out of that boot. The boot is probably not rigged to the toe area at all. So I'm going to select the left foot of Genesis 3 Female. Sometimes it's easiest to do that in the Scene tab. And I'm going to select the left toes, frame on those, and then I'm going to hit Control E, which zeroes whatever I have selected, and it zeroed out the pose of the toes, and now they fit back into the shoe again. Okay. And I'm going to actually move her down to the lower right-hand corner of the scene here to emphasize how small she is compared to the rest of the scene. And I'm actually going to move her back and then move the camera so that her feet are visible. There are types of scenes where you don't want the entire character visible, but you want to do that deliberately. Usually you want the entire character to be visible, or you want to be zooming in on their face or something like that. You don't always have to have the character visible, but you always want to be deliberate with it. Okay. Now, having her hair and cape blow dramatically will add some movement to this scene. So the next thing that I'm going to do is double-click on Genesis 3 Female in the Scene tab to expand, and I'm going to select the Dark Storm item here. I'm not sure which one the cape is part of, so actually I'm going to right-click in the scene on that and choose, oh, it's the Dark Storm armor. There we go. Then I'll go to the Parameters tab and Actor, and it looks like there are some adjustment morphs here, but I don't see cape movement. So let's look. There is a cape bone in the Scene tab called Cape 1. So I'm going to try moving that bone. And nothing happens. The cape bone is dead. Okay, I guess we won't be moving the cape. But we can move the sleeves, it looks like. So I'll sweep her sleeves to her right, our left. And then I'll move her hair. So click on the latent hair and Actor. You can see there's some different headings here. Adjustments, Fit and Adjust, Move and Style. I'm going to click on Move and Style. And there are further subheadings because there are so many morphs in this piece. It's a really nice hair. So I'm going to go to right shoulder and our shoulder right. And now it's blowing to the right. And for left, I think I will put the left shoulder behind her shoulder if I can. So left shoulder back and behind shoulder left. Maybe just behind shoulder left, actually. There we go. And then left shoulder right. So it's sort of behind her and blowing to her right. And then, let's see, left back and right back. I'm going to dial both of those to the right as well. Not every hair has this many morphs, but just about every April YSH hair does. You really can't go wrong with those. Gold Tassel does a lot of morphs as well. You have to choose which artist has a style that you like as well as has the morphs that you want. So by all means, investigate some different ones. Maybe buy like one product from each one and try out the different options that you have. So now I've got her hair blowing to the right. She's looking up. I've got my camera pulled back a little bit. I might fiddle with the focus depth a little bit. And the way that we do that is there's this little image that looks like a magnifying glass up on the far right, the dolly zoom. And I'm going to hold down Control and hold down the right mouse button and wiggle the mouse to move in or out. And now I'm actually changing the focus depth as well as the distance. So when I pull out, let go of both of those buttons, then left click on that and zoom back in, you'll notice that I've got much more of a distortion effect on her body there, which is what I want for this particular scene. Now that I've done that, I'm going to set depth of field for the pullback camera. So I'm going to go to Perspective View, left click on the pullback camera in the Scene tab, and then click on this Frame button again, little square with a plus sign in it. And I can see in the camera controls over here in the Parameters tab that depth of field is off, so I'm going to click On. And I'm going to change the focal distance until that white ball is right on the character's face. because that is the point of focus. And I'm going to dial down the f-stop until it more tightly focuses on her face. You can see those two planes going in and out. The focus area is in between those two planes. So I want those two planes to include her face, but not a lot else, because I want there to be some blur suggesting more movement. Another thing that I can do to add some more emotion to the scene is give her more of a facial expression. Before I do that, I'm going to save, actually. So I'm going to say File, Save As, Scene. This way, if anything crashes, I don't lose my work. I really should have done that earlier, and in fact, I recommend that you do that earlier than I did. So I'm just going to do a quick test render by clicking on the draw style and choosing NVIDIA Iray. I imagine it's going to look pretty shabby at the moment because all I have on is the base HDR and no lights, and I've turned the headlamp off, so it should be pretty dim. But we're going to fix that momentarily. Okay, there's our test render in the viewport. It does look a bit dark, and I want her face to be a bit more expressive than it is there. So I'm going to tweak the expression first and then worry about the lighting. So I'm going to first turn the draw style back to texture shaded by clicking on the draw style button up here and going back to texture shaded. And then I'm going to go to the perspective view camera and select Genesis 3 female and her head, and now we'll use the frame button again to zoom in on the head so that I can get a better look at the facial expression as I'm tweaking it. Now in the parameters tab with the head selected, here under the pose controls I have more options that I don't have when the entire figure is selected, including the expressions dials. These ones that are red are Daz's default ones, so I'm going to dial in excitement and happy. A little less excitement there. A little more happy, a little less excitement. And you can see that it moves the eyebrows and cheeks a little bit, but not that much. And the eyebrows and the cheek flex are things that I often see done wrong or not done enough when people are creating facial expressions. So I'm going to go to brow and brow outer, up, down, and I'm going to dial in the outer brow more. When your inner brow is up more than your outer brow, you give sort of a pained expression. When your outer brow is up more, usually you're happier. And when the entire brow is up the same amount, you look a bit skeptical or surprised. I'm also going to go to the eyes and eyelid lower, up, down, and raise the lower eyelid a little bit because you squint a little bit when you're really smiling. And then I'm going to go to the cheeks area and use the cheek flex and the cheek eye flex and try to dial those together so that they don't develop a crease between them, which can take a little bit of fiddling, but I'm going to go right about to there. If they're dialed to roughly the same amount, sometimes there's problems and sometimes there's not, but with one at 82 and one at 79, it looks like we're okay. And then I'm going to do another quick viewport test render. This one shouldn't have any depth of field because it's through the perspective view camera, and we have no access to the depth of field options of that camera, or indeed any of its settings, which is why you never render through the perspective camera unless you're just doing a quick test render where the lighting doesn't matter, as we're doing now. Okay, she's looking a bit maniacal. Expression looks a little different in the render than it did in the viewport, so I'm going to set the draw style back texture shaded and maybe tweak her eyes a little bit. Going back to eyes, I think I may want to bring the upper eyelid down a little bit. Not too far. And then save again. You can hear my fans getting louder as I do more of these test renders because now the graphics cards are working. And then I'll do another quick test render. There we go. That's still not ideal, but I think it'll look okay in the pullback, so I'm going to stop there with the facial expression. I'm going to go back to texture shaded again, and back to the pullback cam. Now it's time to do some lighting. Now I talked about setting up a 3-point lighting setup with photometric lights in the last tutorial, and I'm going to use a different setup this time because we're using a character with skin, and mesh lights generally look better on skin. And I'm going to demonstrate that to you from the default camera, a little bit closer up. Another benefit to having the character at ground zero is that lights usually load assuming the character is at ground zero. So if you've set up the scene around the position of the character instead of around the set, that makes lighting easier as well. So I'm going to go to my lighting presets and these light arrays that I've saved. And I have a Sunny 16 preset here that I'm going to click on. Then when you go to the render settings and tone mapping, you will see that shutter speed is 200, f-stop is 16, and film ISO is 200. This is roughly a photographic setup for photographing outdoors on a sunny day. If you're photographing at night, you would use 11 instead of 16, Looney 11, and you might use a lower value of shutter speed and ISO. If you want to save that setting for tone mapping, you can go to the library and this little button that looks like a plus sign and choose Render Settings Preset and Sunny 16 there. And then I'm going to uncheck everything except tone mapping and click Accept. Now I have tone mapping settings that I can reapply very quickly instead of re-entering these values numerically. So I'm going to load my V7 demo photometric lights that I've created. You can create your own photometric spotlights using Create and New Spotlight. I went into this in some detail in the second tutorial, but for now, that's how you do that. And if you wish to then save spotlights to the library, you can either use a little plus sign and lights preset, or you can go to the scene and create a group for your spotlights by going to Create and New Group. And then once they're grouped, go to File, Save As, and Scene Subset. And then you can save a scene subset with all of your lights in it that are grouped under that group. In the scene, I'll go to the perspective view so you can see what those actually are. I've got the key light, which is the main light of the scene, aimed at the character, and that is a white light. Haven't changed the color at all. I've left the temperature at 6500, which is a neutral temperature, produces a white color. And with Sunny 16, my luminous flux here is 1,000,000 for being relatively pulled back from the character. Remember that these lights now appear in the view drop down, so I can look through any of those lights. There's the view through the white light. And then I have the orange rim light, which I'm going to adjust its position so that it's fully on this character from behind and to one side. Notice that having the rim light selected in the drop down doesn't actually select it in the scene tab. I have to go select it by clicking in the scene tab to see its settings and parameters. In parameters, you can see the color, which I've made sort of a peach here. You can see the light geometry and the luminous flux, which is how bright the light is, and the temperature, which determines the light's color. 3500 Kelvin is a low temperature, and the lower the temperature of the light, the redder the light is, and the warmer it looks. The higher that temperature, the more blue and cold it looks. And when you want colors like purple or green that aren't covered by the temperature spectrum, usually what I would do is use a medium temperature at 6500, which is the default, and then use the color to get those colors. Meantime, I have this set at 45, looks like 450,000 lumen, because it's relatively close to the character. At my Sunny 16 tone mapping settings, I have to have higher values of these lights than the default value in DAZ Studio. So then the blue contrast I've got over here on the character's other side. Having a blue light on one side and an orange light on the other side adds a little bit of dimensionality that's very nice to have on skin. And the contrast light is yes, it's at 500,000. So both of those are much weaker than the key light. That's what's important for that right now. And then I'm going to go to the pullback again. So right now my scene is lit by this 3-point photo group and the default environment map. But right now I'm going to turn off that environment map, and I'm going to use the existing sun. So right now it's set to 6 p.m. at a latitude and longitude that I think corresponds to roughly where the DAS office is. And there is a sun node, and it's set to none here. And I'm going to actually create a new spotlight, spotlight 2, and this is going to act as the sun. So I'm going to click on none where it says SS Sun Node and choose Spotlight 2. Spotlight 2 is very weak because it's at default light settings, but it'll be a good positional indicator for where my sun is. So I'm going to look through Spotlight 2, and I'm going to click on the entire thing she's standing on in the Scene tab, the environment, and the frame button, and just pull it on back so that my spotlight can roughly represent the position of the sun. I'm having more lag now because of the amount of geometry in my scene, and because my computer is getting warm. I've been using it all day and now I'm making it render. Poor baby. Okay, and I'm going to have the sun be pulled back and a little bit above and to her right, much like the key light, so that those don't really clash positionally. And I'll go back to the pullback, and I'm going to save again. And I think instead of a viewport render, this time I will go ahead and do a test render from the render settings tab. You can see that it's a relatively small size at 494 by 800 there, and new window, and I've got that V7 test 1 is what that says. And so I'm just going to type Control R on my keyboard and let it render. Okay, there's my render. I've cut out some render time here, but you can see that it does look much better than just the plain default HDR when you use the sky system plus a 3-point photo setup. I would like to go briefly into one more setting, which is light geometry. On photometric lights, if you select one of these, I'm selecting the white key light here, under the parameters and light, if you scroll down, you will find light geometry. By default, this is set to point and the height and width to 10. I have rendered with the geometry set to disk and the height and width to 50 on each of these lights. This creates a large disk as a light source instead of a small point, and it's like the difference between rendering with a flashlight you hold in your hand and a large studio light with a reflector behind it. It creates a softer, more diffuse light that looks better on skin. So my advice is generally never to use 0 and 10 for those values unless there is a specific effect that you want from a pinpoint light source. Okay, today you've learned how to load assets from the library, how to pose and adjust them, how to light the scene and change your tone mapping, and how to render. Thank you for watching. Thank you for joining us in our tutorial series, and happy rendering!